Welcome to Grammar 4M. In this booklet, we are going to go over verb tenses and forms. We're going to learn about indirect objects, then we're going to learn how to diagram them. So let's get started with the verb tenses and forms. Once again, this is going to be a review, so I might go a little quickly over this, but just make sure you're reading everything. So we know that each verb tense is a form that expresses the time of the action or the state of the verb. Remember, we work with regular and irregular verbs, so you've got to pay attention to how you conjugate them. And of course, when you're working with the new forms that we have learned, progressive and perfect, we have our helping verbs. They must agree with your subject. So always watch out for that. Let's just go over this stuff real quick. We have our simple tenses. Don't forget about those. We've been working with them all through 1, 2, and 3 grammar levels. We've got past, present, future, and we're just going to make sure that we get those in there so that you're not forgetting those. But of course, we are implementing those simple tenses with our new forms, progressive and perfect. So you just want to make sure that you understand when we're asking for past and when we're asking for past perfect, etc., etc. So in this booklet, we do step it up a notch, and we are going to ask you to conjugate the verbs given with the tense and form, if applicable, given. So just make sure you're going slow. Pay attention to what is being asked of you. Notice how we have different verbs being used. So you need to be able to identify the conjugation of the main verb and if you need a helping verb and how that should agree with the subject. So once again, we do have reference pages in the back, especially for the perfect forms. If you have any questions over this, of course, you can always ask the person who grades the grammar at your center, but just go slow, make sure you're spelling correctly, and hopefully this isn't too hard of an activity for you. Now let's get into the new stuff, indirect objects. Indirect objects are really interesting and really fun, just like the infinitives are. So here we have our explanation. Let's just break it down for a second. An indirect object is a noun or pronoun that receives the direct object. It's not a subject and it's not a PN. It's not the direct object and will never be in the prepositional phrase. It is simply a separate word from all of these other components. So let's look at that in a sentence that we provide. The librarian gave me the new book. What's being given in this book? What's being given in this sentence? The book is being given. That's the direct object. But I am receiving the book. Me is the indirect object because I am indirectly receiving the action of that sentence, but I am directly receiving the direct object. So this is a little tricky to figure out at first. You just kind of have to play with it. So let's look at the rest of this explanation. We know that an indirect object can give similar information as an object of a preposition. That might not seem obvious at first, but let's keep reading. An indirect object does not use to or for to convey the information that a prepositional phrase would. So let's look at that. Monica kicked me the ball. What's being kicked? The ball. Ball is the direct object, but the ball is being kicked to me. I am receiving the ball. I am the indirect object. So if you wanted to, instead of using an indirect object, use a prepositional phrase, you can see this in the next sentence. Monica kicked the ball to me. Now we don't have an indirect object. To me is your prepositional phrase. But these two sentences are giving you the exact same information. So that's the key to indirect objects. They are essentially a part of a prepositional phrase, but there is no preposition. It's just an indirect object. So just make sure you're going slow and you're understanding how these words relate to each other in the sentence. Because in this book, we really ramp it up. We have you identify IOs, DOs, PAs, PNs, OPs. You gotta know it all. So take your time, do what you know first, and then move on from there. So now we're gonna play around with the indirect objects a little bit more through our sentence diagramming. Here's our sentence. The radio station gave its listeners free tickets. Let's get started with the basics. We know our subject, the station. The station is completing the action of giving or gave. And then what is being given? Tickets. Tickets are the direct object. Now let's go ahead and identify the other parts that are easy for us to identify, which are going to be the adjectives. So radio is describing station, the is also describing station, the radio station. And then after that, we have free describing tickets. So now all we have left to identify is its listeners. So the radio station gave its listeners free tickets. The radio station gave to its listeners free tickets. Listeners is the indirect object. It is directly receiving the direct object, indirectly receiving the action of this sentence. So we're going to label that IO, and its is a possessive pronoun that is describing listeners. So far, hopefully you're good. The radio station gave to its listeners free tickets, but we're not using it as a prepositional phrase. Instead, we're using listeners as an indirect object. So now we can start our diagram. Here we have our line, and we have it split to separate the subject and predicate, and we do have a direct object, so we need that short little line. And that's all you do. This is the basic line. We don't need to add anything extra for that indirect object. That's going to be done in a different way. So first, let's say we've got our adjectives describing the subject. We've got an adjective describing a direct object, and now we can figure out what we're going to do with this indirect object. Remember what I said. An indirect object is a prepositional phrase without a preposition. So that's how we're going to diagram it. So let's start that prepositional phrase, quote unquote. We've got our line that's coming off of the verb, but since we don't have a preposition, we just put an X in parentheses because it's an understood lack of preposition. Just kind of like when we put parentheses around you in a command for a subject. It's an understood lack of preposition. And then what we need to do is make our line for what would be our object of the preposition, but instead is our indirect object. And of course, we have a describing word coming off of that. If you are unsure as to how I got this far, then go ahead and take a break and start working in the book and just working with indirect objects, because that will make you more comfortable as to what an indirect object is. But in the meantime, if you'd like, we'll keep going and we're going to fill out this sentence diagram. We have our subject, we have our verb, and we have our direct object. And now we have our describing words, the, radio, to describe station. And now we're going to fill in our indirect object. Once again, we have our understood lack of preposition, and listeners is our indirect object. It's describing listeners. And then free is describing tickets. And that's how you are going to diagram a sentence with an indirect object. I will say, in this booklet, we give you that understood lack of preposition. We have that X in parentheses for you. But in future books, you will not be provided that all the time. So you need to make sure you understand why that X is there and why we are putting that indirect object that way. It's not a direct object. It doesn't go on that main line. Instead, it is just extra information of this verb, essentially. So hopefully this gave you some insight as to what to do with indirect objects, but if you have any questions, please contact the owner of your Gideon Center or whoever grades your grammar. And thank you so much for your attention.